Welcome to the briefing on field condition reporting and braking action advisories. In this briefing, we'll talk about recent changes that the FAA has made to runway field condition reporting in support of the TALPA initiative. This includes the new concept of a runway condition code, which directly correlates the observed runway conditions with airplane landing performance data provided by the manufacturers for use on a contaminated runway. We'll take a look at examples of these reports and codes so you can get familiar with them. And finally, we'll examine how air traffic control and flight service stations communicate field condition reports, runway condition codes, along with braking action reports to pilots. As we learned in the briefing on runway condition assessment, airport operators use their version of the FAA's new Runway Condition Assessment Matrix as a guide when assessing runway conditions. Once the runway conditions have been assessed, the airport operator passes this information on to users through the FAA's NOTAM system. The FAA NOTAM system automatically generates the field condition report. These NOTAMs are based on the airport operator's assessment and generate the appropriate runway codes based on the reported conditions. Airport operators have the capability to upgrade or downgrade the runway condition code based on other objective measures or observations, for example, on the basis of pilot braking action reports. This is an important part of FAA's Takeoff and Landing Performance Assessment Initiative, aimed at standardizing field condition NOTAMs while reducing the potential for human error. These field condition NOTAMs and runway condition codes are important decision-making tools available to pilots and airplane operators when considering whether or not to take off or land on a wet runway or one that's contaminated with standing water, snow, slush, ice, or any combination of these contaminants. A field condition report is a notice to airmen, or NOTAM, that's generated to reflect pavement surface conditions on runways, taxiways, and aprons. Any of these surfaces may have a field condition NOTAM issued when it's in a condition other than dry. However, pilots and airplane operators are especially concerned about the condition of the runway. The NOTAM keyword, runway, abbreviated RWY, is used to identify a field condition NOTAM that applies to a runway. Another keyword, FICON, identifies a NOTAM as a field condition NOTAM. Here we see a field condition NOTAM that applies to runway 7 at Denver International. The standard practice is to issue these NOTAMs for runway or runways currently in use at the airport. The runway condition codes are generated only for runways that have paved surfaces, which include asphalt, asphalt concrete, concrete, and porous friction course surfaces. Field condition NOTAMs issued for runways that are not paved, for example, a gravel runway, will not be assigned runway condition codes. The runway condition codes are a new part of field condition NOTAMs and replace runway friction measurement values that were used in the past. These codes are generated only for runways that have paved surfaces, and then only when more than 25% of the runway's total surface area is covered by a reportable contaminant. Runways that are not paved, for example a gravel runway, are not assigned runway condition codes. A separate runway condition code is generated for the touchdown third, the midpoint third, and the rollout third of the runway. Each code is generated by FAA's NOTAM system using the observed runway conditions or contaminants reported by the airport operator and FAA's Runway Condition Assessment Matrix. These codes, numbered from 0 to 6, are a measure of the relative slipperiness of the runway surface. The lower the number, the more slippery that surface is likely to be. These runway condition codes are an important tool since they alert the pilot that the runway is no longer dry and that they need to consider the effects of the reported runway condition on the airplane's takeoff or landing performance. Following the runway condition code, the field condition NOTAM includes the coverage, depth, and the type of contaminant for each third of the runway. Read the NOTAM. If the observed conditions are the same along the entire runway, the field condition NOTAM is abbreviated to show only a single contaminant type and depth. Up to 2 separate contaminant types can be reported for each runway third.
The two contaminants are tied together by the word "and." The runway condition code assigned is based on the worst contaminant type and depth observed, since this will have the most critical impact on airplane performance. In order to standardize field condition NOTAMs and to make them more useful to pilots when they assess takeoff and landing performance, the FAA has carefully defined the types of runway conditions and runway contaminants reported in field condition NOTAMs. As we learned in the briefing on contaminant types, not all runway contaminants have a known effect on an airplane's takeoff or landing performance. Further, only those contaminant types that have a known effect on landing performance will result in the assignment of a runway condition code. If you see a contaminant for which a code is not assigned, that means its effect on an airplane's landing performance is unknown, and landing data is generally not available from the airplane's manufacturer. For some runway contaminants, the impact on an airplane's takeoff or landing performance depends on how deep it is. Takeoff and landing performance data on a contaminated runway is often differentiated by specific depths of a contaminant type. For example, the depth of wet snow. The FAA's new guidance concerning field condition NOTAMs has been updated to align the reporting of these contaminant depths to those most often used with the airplane's performance data. The FAA's new guidance also emphasizes reporting the coverage of a particular contaminant on the runway. Any contamination observed on a runway is rarely uniform, and its coverage may vary significantly within each runway third, especially as a result of airplane use. When the observed coverage within each runway third varies, the observed percentages are added together and then divided by 3. If the resulting total runway coverage is 25% or less, runway condition codes are not assigned to the runway. In the example shown, the coverage in each runway third, when added together and divided by 3, is only 16%. Usually, in these circumstances, the runway may be considered to be dry for performance planning purposes. In rare cases, it's possible for a runway third to be contaminated with a coverage exceeding 50%, while the other 2/3 of the runway may be dry or have minimal coverage. In these situations, runway condition codes may not be reported for the runway, even though 1/3 of the runway may have significant surface contamination present. The observed contamination and coverage within each third is still to be reported to aid pilot awareness of these situations. In some cases, there may be isolated areas of contamination on the runway that fall below the greater than 25% threshold. The airport operator can report what's left of the runway as either dry or wet. In this situation, only the percentage of the contamination and its depth will be reported to the pilot. If the runway is dry, a runway condition code is not generated, and we can consider the runway dry for airplane performance planning. If the runway is also wet, then the field condition report will list the percentage of the runway that's wet, and if it's more than 25%, generate a runway condition code of 5 for the applicable third. In this situation, the pilot should use the aircraft's wet runway airplane performance data. At airports with multiple runways, not every runway may have a field condition NOTAM. Following a major weather event, such as a snowstorm, as the runways are cleared, their condition will naturally improve and may become dry, while other runways at the airport remain contaminated and have runway condition codes assigned. Don't assume that just because one runway is reporting contamination that all runways are likewise contaminated and have the same condition codes. The absence of a FICON NOTAM with runway condition codes could mean the runway is dry, or it could mean the runway is simply wet and the airport operator elected not to report the condition. A runway condition code of 0 identifies a runway with minimal or non-existent braking deceleration. When taking off or landing, the pilot should expect nil braking action. If the observed contamination on any third of the runway results in a condition code of 0, or if a pilot reports nil braking action, that runway is not safe, and the FAA requires the airport operator to close the runway until its condition is improved. That's why pilots will never see a field condition NOTAM with a runway condition code of 0. Should a pilot report nil braking action after landing, air traffic control is required to immediately cease operations on that runway and must alert the airport operator. The Runway Condition Assessment Matrix identifies the contaminants that would normally result in runway code assignments of 0 or 1. However, the airport operator may determine the runway's slipperiness is not as bad as these contaminants would indicate. The airport operator may upgrade these runways to reflect the observed stopping performance, but only to a code no higher than a 3.
A dry runway is a normal condition and presents no adverse impact on takeoff or landing performance. Field condition reports are not used to report a runway that's completely dry. However, it may be necessary to report a portion of the runway as dry when other portions of the runway are either wet or contaminated. In the example shown, the touchdown third of the runway is either dry or the coverage of dampness on the runway surface is 25% or less. However, the midfield and rollout thirds are still observed as being wet, with a coverage of greater than 25%.
The Runway Condition Code of 5 identifies a runway that's damp, or one that has water present on its surface but no more than 1/8 inch deep. While airports are highly encouraged to issue a field condition NOTAM for a wet runway, they don't have to do so. Therefore, pilots should not rely on getting a field condition NOTAM for a wet runway. Short of personally inspecting the runway, you may need to use other means at your disposal to determine if the runway is likely to be wet at the time of takeoff or landing. Clues that a runway might be wet include METAR, ATIS, or automated reports that include rain, showers, or drizzle. Ground or airborne weather radar that shows precipitation on or moving toward the airport may also give an indication that the runway is wet or is likely to become wet very soon. If it appears likely that the runway will be wet, then your calculations and assessments should be based on using wet runway performance data.
When the runway is contaminated, the airport operator has to take action. This may include plowing or sweeping the runway surface, or applying sand or de-icing fluid to the runway. The field condition NOTAM informs the pilot on what actions have been taken and reports any remaining contamination on the runway's treated and untreated areas. Field condition reporting will continue to describe any accumulations at the edge of the treated area, such as snowbanks, berms, windrows, snow piles, and drifts that might obstruct the movement of aircraft on the runway.
Runway grooving and porous friction course overlays are two examples of skid-resistant surfaces that help channel water away from the contact area between the runway and the airplane's tire. These surfaces greatly improve braking performance when the runway is wet. However, these surfaces can easily lose their effectiveness through normal wear and tear or from the accumulation of rubber deposits on the runway. The airport must monitor these surfaces and alert users if they've deteriorated below acceptable levels. When these surfaces no longer meet the minimum FAA requirements, the airport operator must issue a slippery when wet field condition NOTAM anytime the runway is observed to be wet. A runway condition code of 3 is assigned to each runway third. Unlike other field condition NOTAMs, the slippery when wet runway condition codes of 333 are only in effect when the runway is wet and are used in place of the wet runway 555 codes. The airport operator may further downgrade the runway condition code to a value of 2 or 1 if the operator believes it better represents the slipperiness of the runway surface.
Field condition NOTAMs, along with the accompanying runway condition codes, are considered temporary NOTAMs and remain valid for a maximum of 24 hours. The time stamp in the NOTAM identifies the start of activity time and includes the time at which the airport operator expects to issue a new field condition NOTAM. In this example, the field condition NOTAM was issued January 4th at 02:53 hours Zulu. The airport operator expects to have an updated NOTAM issued January 5th by 11:15 Zulu. If runway conditions change, the airport operator is required to update the field condition NOTAM. Pilots can receive field condition NOTAMs and runway condition codes from a number of sources. Field condition NOTAMs can come from a flight service station briefer, the FAA's direct user access terminals, DUATs, or through many of the third-party flight planning service providers that pilots commonly use. Airline pilots receive their NOTAMs as part of the airline's dispatch function. Once in the air, field condition NOTAMs and runway condition codes can be furnished by air traffic control through flight service, from the airline dispatcher, or from the airport itself over Unicom. During pre-flight planning, pilots generally will see field condition reports and runway condition codes for their destination and alternate airports. When you see a runway condition code in a field condition NOTAM, that's your first clue that the condition of the runway could impact your plane's performance on takeoff, landing, or rollout. That's your indication you should look closer at the required takeoff or landing performance for your aircraft. Air traffic controllers at towered airports, along with flight service station personnel, are responsible for disseminating field condition reports, runway condition codes, and pilot braking action reports. These FAA personnel also receive pilot braking action reports, a very important component of the TALPA process. Let's look at some examples of how air traffic controllers and flight service personnel provide this information to pilots.
Workload permitting, controllers can relay field condition NOTAMs to pilots upon request using plain language. At airports with an ATIS, the current runway condition codes are transmitted in the current broadcast. At airports without an ATIS broadcast, the controller will furnish the current code to the aircraft prior to departure or arrival. ATC is required to transmit updated runway condition codes to pilots and to update the current ATIS broadcast as soon as possible after they are received. While the runway condition codes alone may be adequate to perform your landing assessment calculation, the full FICON to include contaminant type and depth is required to appropriately account for the effects of runway contamination on takeoff performance. With the introduction of runway condition codes, FAA has discontinued disseminating runway friction value reports to aircraft. Therefore, pilots should no longer expect to receive mu values for a runway. Controllers at an en route center or at a TRACON are also responsible for furnishing the pilot with the current runway condition codes for an airport. An en route center controller will provide these codes prior to issuing the en route descent clearance, and the terminal controller will provide them prior to issuing an approach clearance, depending on the circumstances of the flight. These controllers will also issue the runway condition codes to any departing flight prior to departure from an uncontrolled airport. They're also responsible for issuing any updated runway condition codes to pilots. Upon request, these controllers can provide pilots with the field condition NOTAMs using plain language, providing their workload permits. Pilot braking action reports are a critical component in the runway condition assessment process, and pilots are encouraged to furnish these reports to ATC after landing. We'll describe these reports in greater detail in a later briefing. When ATC receives a braking action report that includes the term medium, poor, or nil, or when weather conditions may result in deteriorating runway conditions, they'll include the statement braking action advisories are in effect on the ATIS broadcast. ATC will then furnish the latest braking action report to each departing and arriving aircraft, or advise if no recent braking action report has been received for the takeoff or landing runway. In addition, they'll inform the airport management when the reported braking action is medium or below, so operators can do what they can to improve the runway's condition. In Alaska, FAA flight service stations provide airport advisory services and automatic flight information service broadcasts at selected airports that are not served by an operating control tower. The automatic flight information service broadcasts are similar to ATIS broadcasts at controlled airports. These broadcasts include the current runway condition codes provided by the airport operator. If pilots use the airport advisory service, flight service will furnish the current field condition NOTAMs, runway condition codes, and any pilot braking action reports that have been received. For other airports without these services, the pilot can contact the nearest flight service to receive the latest runway condition codes and field condition reports. At uncontrolled airports, the airport operator is responsible for furnishing arriving aircraft with the reported field condition NOTAMs along with the runway condition codes, either on the Common Traffic Advisory frequency or the Unicom frequency. Field condition NOTAMs are also issued for other movement areas on the airport, for example, airport taxiways and aprons, and remain largely unchanged from what pilots have received in the past. As the name implies, runway condition codes are issued exclusively for paved runways. Movement Area FICON NOTAMs will contain the keyword apron or taxiway to help pilots identify the airport area affected by the NOTAM. These NOTAMs will also include pilot braking action reports if available. The airport is required to close any surface that's unsafe immediately. For example, if a pilot reports nil braking action. However, if the taxiway or ramp area has a condition report but remains open, it's usable in the opinion of the airport operator. As we close, let's review some of the key points in this briefing. The FAA has revised the format and terminology used in field condition NOTAMs to closely align with the terms used in airplane performance calculations. The observed runway conditions are now reported for each runway third. However, the airport operator may elect not to report a runway that is wet. The FAA also introduced the new concept of runway condition codes that alert pilots to a contaminated runway. These codes are used to associate runway contamination with landing distance performance data. Field condition NOTAMs and runway condition codes are furnished to pilots primarily through NOTAMs, which should be reviewed prior to flight. ATC can provide pilots with the latest field condition NOTAMs upon request. Because of their importance in landing performance assessment, runway condition codes are included in the ATIS broadcast and furnished by ATC prior to the top of descent and with the approach clearance. Pilots can request field condition NOTAMs and runway condition codes from flight service. Pilots in Alaska can expect to receive them as part of the automated Flight Information Service broadcast or through an airport advisory service broadcast at locations where these services are provided. At uncontrolled airports, pilots can obtain the latest field condition NOTAMs and runway condition codes through the Common Traffic Advisory Frequency or through UNICOM. Field condition NOTAMs for movement areas other than the runway will still be issued as they were in the past. A runway condition code is issued only for paved runways. Movement area field condition NOTAMs, as well as field condition NOTAMs for runways that are not paved, may include braking action reports on these surfaces when they are available. And that concludes your briefing.